Great. Well, hello everyone. My name is Alexis Guild. I am the Senior Health Policy Analyst at Farmworker Justice. We are a national farm worker advocacy organization based in DC, but we also have an office in Oakland, California. This PowerPoint is focused on public charge and farm workers. And so during this presentation, we will be discussing who are farm workers, the structural issues that they face, and how those structural issues affect their access to healthcare specifically. And then we'll be talking about public charge specifically within the context of farm worker communities. And really the goal of this presentation is to familiarize yourself with the farm worker community and the potential impact of public charge in farm worker communities. So whether you work with farm worker communities or would just like to know more about farm worker communities, hopefully you'll find this presentation helpful. So we are going to start by talking about farm workers. And what's important to note is that data is actually quite limited when it comes to farm workers. So the data I'm about to present is data that is from the National Agricultural Workers Survey, which is a survey conducted by the U.S. Department of Labor. But this data has its challenges. It's a small sample size, and it does not include H-2A workers. And there are other reasons why the data set is not the most accurate. However, it is the best data that we have. So it is the data that we typically tend to use when talking about U.S. farm workers, and I'll be referring to this data, what we call the NAS data. We will be referring to this data throughout the presentation. But to begin with, there are approximately 2.5 million farm workers in the United States, approximately 4 million if you include their families. California, of course, has the largest number of farm workers. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of U.S. farm workers are in California. 76% of farm workers are foreign-born. 69% from Mexico, 6% from Central America. So the vast majority are from Spanish-speaking countries. There are a growing number of workers coming from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, but specifically I think we'll be seeing more workers from Guatemala. And then there are a small percentage of workers from other parts of the world. More than half of workers have work authorization, meaning that they are either U.S. citizens, they have green cards, they have some lawful status, or they are H-2A workers. Farm workers do have a variety of statuses between U.S. citizens, lawful permanent resident, refugee, asylee, DACA, and H-2A. We'll be talking more about H-2A workers in a moment. H-2A workers are workers who are here in the United States on temporary non-immigrant visas, and approximately 5 to 10% of workers in the U.S. are on H-2A visas. But let's talk a little bit more about H-2A workers and what the H-2A program is for those of you who may not be familiar. So essentially the H-2A program is a program that provides non-immigrant temporary visas to workers to work in agriculture. And employers must apply to the U.S. Department of Labor. They basically have to show that they have a shortage of domestic workers. They apply to the U.S. Department of Labor saying we need X number of workers. They apply for those number of positions. The U.S. Department of Labor certifies or approves those positions. And then the employer tends to work with recruiters in Mexico and other countries abroad to find workers. The workers go to the U.S. consulates in their home countries and they apply for a visa and come to the United States. The H-2A workers who come to the United States must work for the employers who sponsor them. That means that their visas are directly tied to their employers, which in some cases is problematic and certainly creates additional barriers for H-2A workers. They are allowed to work in the United States for up to 10 months. H-2A workers do tend to come back year after year, but they have to go back to their home country and then go back to the consulate in order to get another visa in order to come back to the United States. There is no path to citizenship for H-2A workers. They also are not able to bring any spouses or family members. There are certain requirements that employers must abide by in order to be part of the H-2A program. This includes requirements around the provision of housing and transportation, a minimum wage, which is determined by a number of factors that I won't get into, but would be happy to discuss offline. And the minimum wage may vary by state. In California for 2019, the wage was $13.92 an hour. The employers also must provide workers' compensation insurance, and then there are other protections related to the length of their contract, and so on and so forth. More H-2A workers are being brought to the United States by farm labor contractors, also known as contratistas. The challenge with farm labor contractors is, unlike a traditional employer, the H-2A workers who are here with farm labor contractors may actually work on a number of farms, and they also may move. So they may start in one area of the state and may end up throughout their time in the United States moving to various other parts of the state, other counties, or possibly even other states, depending on the farm labor contractor and with whom the farm labor contractor works. As I mentioned, the vast majority are from Mexico, and most are men between 18 and 35 years old. So they tend to be young, healthy men. I want to talk a little bit about the structural issues that are faced by farm workers. And I am going to first talk about their working conditions. For those of you who work with farm workers, you know that the working conditions of farm workers are difficult. They not only are exposed to numerous hazards such as pesticides, falls from ladders, heat stress, and musculoskeletal injuries, they also are subject to harassment. Specifically, women are exposed to sexual harassment in the field. They also tend to have working conditions that are inadequate. They lack job security. There's a fear of employer retaliation. They're more likely to work in hazardous environments, and they also suffer from low wages. There are federal and state standards to protect workers in the fields from occupational hazards. These standards include the Worker Protection Standard, which protects workers from pesticide exposure, the Field Sanitation Standard that requires employers to provide basic sanitation such as toilets as well as water in the fields. And in California, there's also a heat stress standard to ensure that workers who are working in high temperatures are able to access shade when needed. However, enforcement is lacking, and due to the fact that there is a fear of employer retaliation, due to the lack of job security, farm workers are less likely to report any kind of violations. So it's more likely that farm workers are working in fields that may not quite live up to the standards that are currently in place. They also, in addition to poor working conditions, tend to also have poor living conditions. Farm worker wages are low, and housing is expensive, especially here in California. Farm workers tend to live in substandard and overcrowded housing. These housing conditions include barracks, mobile homes, tents, apartments, motels. Some may even live in their cars. Some may live with multiple families in one bedroom apartment or other small living spaces. Some workers, including those who are H-2A workers, live in employer-provided housing. The employer-provided housing varies depending on where you are, and their conditions may also vary depending on the employer, but employer-provided housing tends to be more isolated than general farm worker housing. And farm worker housing just generally tends to be removed from the rest of the community. So farm worker housing can be difficult to find, and certainly partnering with legal services organizations, health centers, and others who do outreach to farm worker communities is helpful in terms of finding the farm workers where they live. The poor living conditions lead to a variety of healthcare issues, as you can imagine, including gastrointestinal disease, UTIs, lead poisoning, asthma, so on and so forth. So it's important to keep in mind that the living conditions are one factor that impact access to healthcare and access to community resources. Finally, I want to talk about discrimination. Discrimination is a major issue for farm workers generally, but I want to talk specifically about discrimination against Indigenous workers. There is an increasing number of Indigenous workers. These are workers who come from Indigenous communities in Mexico and Guatemala. There already tends to be, as many of you I'm sure know, a hierarchy within communities, within farm worker communities and within Latino communities more generally. There sometimes is a hierarchy between those who may be Indigenous and those who are not Indigenous. Indigenous workers in the fields tend to have lower paying jobs, and they tend to have more dangerous jobs. The challenge also faced by Indigenous workers is that Spanish is not their primary language for the most part. So Indigenous workers may know a little bit of Spanish, but actually may be more comfortable in their Indigenous language. And because they may be more comfortable in their Indigenous language, they may not be able to fully communicate in Spanish. So there is a need for interpreters. Unfortunately, there is a lack of interpreters who speak Indigenous languages, and even within Indigenous languages, there are dialects. So for example, there is Indigenous language called Mixteco, and there's actually a difference between Mixteco Alto and Mixteco Bajo. And so knowing the differences, knowing the subtleties between the different communities where these languages are spoken is important. These languages also tend to be mostly spoken as opposed to written. So it's just an additional barrier faced by Indigenous workers. In addition to that, they may have their own beliefs around health and around health care, and the causes and the ways to heal from various injuries and illnesses. So Western medicine, going to a doctor, taking prescribed medication may not be aligned with their cultural beliefs. Some examples of Indigenous languages include Mixteco, which I mentioned, as well as Zapotec, Triqui, Mam, and Quiche, and there are many others. There are numerous job-related barriers to healthcare access, and I touched on many of these when I spoke about the structural barriers. The ones that I want to go into just a little bit more depth, and again, this is to understand why farm workers may not access healthcare and how public charge could really create additional barriers to their access to healthcare, which is already a huge challenge for this community. One barrier is workers may not have their own transportation and may in fact depend on employers for transportation. This is particularly true for H-2A workers. H-2A workers don't have their own transportation, so they must rely on their employers for any kind of transportation needs, whether it's to go to Walmart or to go to a clinic. Some workers also frequently move from farm to farm. They are migratory workers, and so they may be in one area for a specific amount of time and then may go to another area. This is especially challenging in terms of continuity of care. So for chronic conditions like diabetes, having that continuity of care can be a real challenge for migratory workers. Farm workers also don't have sick leave. So workers may be reluctant to leave work to seek medical care. If they leave work, they have to take time off, which means they lose wages, and so they may only seek care in emergency situations. In addition to that, they tend to work non-traditional hours. So farm work is not a 9-to-5 job. It could be a 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. job, which means that the time that they are available to go to the doctor is outside of normal business hours. So clinics may not be open at the times when the workers need to access them. Other barriers to healthcare access, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with these barriers, but they include poverty, cultural and linguistic barriers, which I talked about. And then let's face it, the U.S. healthcare system is quite confusing. And if you are coming from another country or another culture, it's even more so. And so just navigating that system can be quite difficult. So that just means that there's a general lack of trust in healthcare providers and a general lack of healthcare access amongst farm workers. So having talked about the structural barriers faced by farm workers, I want to talk about public charge and how public charge will affect farm workers and their access to health care. So just as a quick reminder, public charge is a test that's only applied at certain points of the immigration process. So it's applied when you are applying to enter the United States. It is also applied when you are applying for your green card for your lawful permanent residency. It is highly discretionary, and they apply what they call a totality of circumstances test. So there are a number of factors that must be considered when the public charge test is being applied. There are many immigration statuses that the public charge does not apply to, including refugees and asylees. And right now, it is really only cash aid and long-term care in terms of public benefits that really count against a person when it comes to public charge. H-2A applicants, because they are applying for a visa at the U.S. consulate in their home country, are subject to public charge. Now, recently, there have been revisions to the Foreign Affairs Manual, and although the definition did not change, they did revise it so that they considered more negative factors. And so in addition, in terms of the totality of circumstances, they are looking at the applicant's age, their health, their family status, as well as their financial resources, but also their use of non-cash benefits, their lack of private health insurance for medical conditions, and benefits used by sponsors or family members. Now, H-2A workers have a slightly different process than those individuals who are applying through a family member. So in terms of benefits used by sponsors, that's not really an issue for H-2A workers because they're being sponsored by an employer. And this only affects decisions made by consulates abroad. We have not heard of any H-2A worker who has been denied a visa due to public charge, due to these changes to the Foreign Affairs Manual. We have not heard or seen anything as of the recording of this webinar. But it's important to keep in mind that H-2A workers are in fact subject to the public charge because as we talk more about the totality of circumstances, certainly it will be a factor for them. Now, as I mentioned, they're subject to the public charge, but it's unclear, again, because H-2A workers are being sponsored by employers, because they're coming to the United States to work, it's unclear exactly how public charge will affect H-2A workers' visa applications. H-2A workers, due to their non-immigrant status, are not eligible for Medicaid. They're not eligible for SNAP, and they're not eligible for other public benefits. Here in California, although Medicaid is quite expansive, H-2A workers, due to their temporary non-immigrant status, are not eligible for Medi-Cal. So in terms of health insurance, the only health insurance H-2A workers qualify for are tax credits in covered California. But that is not one of the benefits that is part of the public charge determination. So in terms of the public benefits, H-2A workers are not eligible for any of the benefits that are in the proposed rule. Some H-2A workers may have their visas extended after entering the U.S., and this may be because an employer decides that they need the workers for longer than what they initially wrote in the application. So under the proposed rule, they may be subject to an additional public charge assessment at the time of the renewal of their visa. But again, all of this is highly discretionary, and this is under the proposed rule. All of that is to say that H-2A workers, although the impact of public charge is somewhat unclear in terms of their ability to actually come to the United States and work in the United States, it could lead to increased vulnerability because workers depend on their employers for their visas and are already reluctant to seek services. So the chilling effect that we hear so much about around public charge is even more intense amongst H-2A workers. And remember, farm workers can have any immigration status, and not all immigration statuses will be affected by public charge. So just to keep in mind that public charge in terms of farm worker communities, just like any other immigrant community, only really applies to a small number of workers. But the general chilling effect is certainly much wider than that, and could have an effect on workers more generally in terms of their access to public benefits. But really, the factors that I want to focus more on is actually beyond the public benefits. Because as I mentioned, the public benefits, the H-2A workers don't qualify for it. And honestly, most farm workers actually don't qualify or don't currently access the public benefits, even in the proposed rule. So it is really those other factors that really will affect farm workers the most. In terms of the public benefits, only 18% of workers in the National Cultural Workers Survey in the NAS reported that a member of their household received SNAP, and only 44% reported that a member of their household receives health insurance from a quote-unquote government program. And they don't define in the NAS what government program means. It's likely Medicaid, but they don't define it. So farm workers really aren't accessing the public benefits. But let's look at these other factors. The factors that are really the ones that are the ones that will most affect farm workers are the ones like the income and the limited English proficiency and the high school equivalent level of education and having a large household and the lack of private health insurance. Those are the factors that really will be the ones that may impact more so farm workers' ability to adjust their status if they end up adjusting to a lawful permanent resident status, or if perhaps as an H-2A worker, you're applying to enter the United States. And again, it's important to note that this is all highly discretionary. But I just want to talk a little bit more about these negative factors. So the reason why those factors I just mentioned in particular will be most difficult for farm workers to overcome is because of the data in this slide. So for example, the average household income of workers is between $20,000 and just under $25,000 a year. 1/3 of families earn below 100% of the federal poverty level. So that means that farm workers may not be able to actually be at that 125% federal poverty level threshold, which if you're below that threshold is a negative factor when looking at the totality of circumstances. And farm worker families tend to be large. So almost 2/3 of farm worker families with 6 or more members are below 100% of the federal poverty level. Farm workers also don't necessarily work year-round. Because of the seasonality of agriculture, some farm workers may only work for 50 weeks of the year or for 40 weeks of the year. On average, farm workers did not work approximately 11 weeks in the previous year. So there are gaps of employment, which also means gaps in income. Only 47% of farm workers have health insurance. And of those, only 29% receive it from an employer. So few farm worker employers actually offer health insurance to their workers. And only a small number of those workers who actually receive an offer of employer insurance actually accept it. So in that, there's a factor that focuses on lack of health insurance if you have a medical condition. And farm workers, again, because of their living conditions, because of their working conditions, are more prone to chronic conditions such as diabetes and high blood pressure. They also are prone to other illnesses, and many lack health insurance, which is one of those factors in terms of the totality of circumstances. In addition, farm workers tend to have on average an 8th grade education, which is well below that high school threshold. And they also report low or limited English proficiency. Certainly, there are strategies to talk about public charge to farm worker communities, and many of these strategies are similar to strategies you would use with other communities, with other immigrant communities specifically. The most important is to really bring the message to the workers where they live and work. Farm workers tend to not really go to the health center or go to legal services due to the various barriers, due to the lack of transportation, due to the lack of sick leave. But many organizations actually do go to the workers. They provide health care at housing or at the fields, or they provide legal education and other services where the farm workers live and work. And so in order to really bring the message about public charge and provide that education about what is public charge and to deter the chilling effect that may occur, it's important to develop partnerships with health centers, legal services organizations, and others who are familiar with the farm worker community. It's also important to send trusted messengers to provide the education. Promotores de salud, community health workers, outreach workers. These are workers who tend to be from the community, understand the community, speak the language, and many actually were farm workers or are still farm workers themselves. So they understand what the needs are, what the concerns are. Some may find it helpful to do outreach to growers and to have growers or crew leaders be messengers. And I would say that you really have to be cognizant of the farm worker community, because some growers, some crew leaders may have good relationships with their workers, others may not. So it's somewhat complicated in terms of doing outreach to growers and farmers and farm labor contractors and crew leaders and using them as messengers around public charge. I certainly would advise anyone who is thinking about that to maybe talk to other organizations in their community and see what their thoughts are on that, because it's not always appropriate. And some workers, due to the imbalance of the relationship between the growers, the labor contractors, the crew leaders, and the workers themselves, may find it intimidating to receive information about something as sensitive as public charge from a crew leader or from a grower or from a farm labor contractor. So certainly I think it should be assessed within your community, and then you can decide what's the best way to approach that messaging. It's certainly also important to develop easy to understand materials, and specifically materials that respond to the unique needs of farm worker communities. Because again, as we discussed, farm worker communities have unique needs and concerns, specifically around public charge, but also around healthcare access and access more generally. And that is the conclusion of this module. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. My information is on this slide, and I'd be happy to discuss this module or any questions related to farm workers or farm worker access to healthcare.